Welcome to Power Talks with Santosh Shah. We have with us today Mr. Alexander Pitt, the resident representative of International Monetary Fund in Nepal. This year, the world is facing its first global recession after World War II. Several nations, especially South Asia, is struggling with terrorism and conflict that has sidelined the focus on economy. Mr. Pitt, Sri Lanka now seems to be hopeful about a stable nation. How will this further trigger the IMF loan to Sri Lanka that has been delayed for a while?
Well, first of all, let me say that we welcome the end of the fighting and we look forward to an improved situation in Sri Lanka. We have been in talks with the Sri Lankan government for some time about possible IMF assistance, and the talks are now at an advanced stage. We have not set a date with our executive board for approval of a loan so far, but we hope to do so in the next few weeks.
What is the major focus of IMF, the major objective, and why does the world need IMF?
Well, the IMF was founded in 1944 to prevent a recurrence of the depression of the interwar period. Its task is to ensure stable exchange and international monetary cooperation, which will help to promote the growth of international trade and with it rising living standards and high employment. The IMF has two tools at its disposal to achieve these goals. The first is policy advice. We are talking regularly to our 185 member countries. We discuss the economic challenges with the authorities of each country and possible policy responses. Especially with respect to the current situation, the IMF is also uniquely positioned to provide global analysis of the linkages between the financial sector and the real economy.
At this time of global economic crisis, how is IMF revising its ways or innovating new ones to deal with the global recession?
We have introduced several new innovations. First of all, our lending capacity has been tripled to some 750 billion US dollars. At the same time, global liquidity has been also boosted, that is through the accounts that member countries have with the IMF. We have extended financial assistance to more than 20 countries and committed 157 billion US dollars. I think that has made a significant contribution to stabilizing the situation in several critical areas, for example in Eastern Europe, but also for many low-income countries. We have also expanded our toolkit. We have introduced a new lending window which was designed for very strong performing economies and provides very large financial resources to these economies. A little bit in the longer term, we have there is a process underway already that started before the crisis to give more voice to emerging market countries and low-income countries. This is a longer process, and the first phase of this reform has been approved already in early 2008. But the next stage, which is a review of the shares of each member in the IMF, will be advanced from 2013 to 2011. So we are going to see a rebalancing of the weights as well there.
The global economic crisis has affected both the developed nations and the developing nations. In the long term, in what unique or separate ways will this affect both the nations?
Well, the crisis had its origin in the financial markets of the developed world, most specifically the US, and has spread from there over the entire world. I think the difference of the impact is that the financial sectors of the advanced economies are quite severely affected. And as a consequence of that, output and demand has been falling very steeply. Developing countries are less affected by the financial fallout on their systems. I mean, there's less capital flowing to those countries, but the financial system of those countries are have not been so exposed to the Western financial markets, so they're less affected.
Over the last decade, we've read scores of articles that predicts India and China to be the century's superpowers. Will this economic crisis help India and China to progress faster in the economic field compared to the developed nations, or will it hit back them as well?
Well, the crisis has certainly affected both China and India negatively, but they're still growing, and they're still growing at a much higher, faster rate than the developed countries, as they have done in the past. But that said, I think the crisis has driven home the importance, especially of China and on the global economic stage. China already has the third largest economy in the world after the United States and Japan, and it is a very large creditor country. It has also passed a very large stimulus package, which is a valuable contribution to maintaining global demand in this crisis situation. So yes, I think the crisis is accelerating the emergence of these players onto the global economic stage and in global economic policy making.
We'll continue with our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks. We are in conversation with Mr. Alexander Pitt, the resident representative of IMF to Nepal. Mr. Pitt, in context of international monetary exchange, Nepal's currency is directly dependent on the Indian currency. Does that limit Nepal from participating actively in the international trade and open up its global economic opportunities?
On the contrary, the peg of the Nepali rupee to the Indian rupee is a source of stability and confidence for the Nepalese economy. India is the largest trading partner of Nepal. 60% of exports and imports are coming from India and going to India. The Indian economy is huge next to Nepal's. It is natural that it's a dominant trading partner for Nepal. So a stable relationship of the currency with the Indian currency is a good thing. The integration of Nepal with other countries than India, including with China, is somewhat constrained by geography and transportation costs, but this is something that cannot be changed.
If Nepal's banking sector has to actively or directly participate in the global banking sector, what kind of political environment should Nepal thrive for?
Well, I think the Nepalese banking sector has actually survived quite well even during the conflict times. It has grown in the number of banks, in profitability, in importance in the economy in general. But of course, you're right. The sector is very much circumscribed by the capital controls that exist in Nepal. But as the global economic crisis has erupted, that has been a good thing. But over the longer run, Nepal's banking sector should, of course, be able to participate in the international financial marketplace. But for this to be successful, there are a number of requirements. It requires very strong supervision. That has also been shown by the global economic crisis. So the Nepal Rashtra Bank must increase its supervisory capacity. The second factor is that the financial sector in Nepal needs to consolidate. There are too many banks and too many small banks. Instead, we should have fewer banks and bigger banks that can compete with foreign banks when they come to Nepal in next year under the WTO rules, when the banking sector will be open to foreign competition here.
Industry, communications, transportations, and the regular works of Nepal are continually disrupted because of the power cut and oil crisis. The Nepal Oil Corporation is normally in debt to pay back to the Indian Oil Corporation. How can Nepal figure out a way to pay back the debt to Indian Oil Corporation and to deal with the flux in international oil pricing?
Well, at the moment, Nepal Oil Corporation is profitable thanks to the decline in international fuel prices. So these profits are at the moment being used to repay not only the IOC but also the government and private sector institutions that have extended credit to the NOC during the time when fuel prices were very high. But we cannot rely on oil prices to remain as low as they are at the moment. When the global economy is recovering, they will surely rise. Already this is happening as economic news from China are getting better. In the longer run, a mechanism must be found to tie domestic fuel prices to movements in international oil markets. This can be achieved through an automatic pricing formula. The IMF has provided extensive technical assistance on this.
Over last decade, news of several farmers committing suicide in India was widespread as a result of low produce and their inability to pay back the bank loans. Last year, the Indian government exempted soft loans to the farmer, which relieved them, and that probably was a good strategy in their context. This year, Nepal has opted a similar strategy. But in Nepalese context, will this be beneficial for both the farmers and the banks?
Well, I think this is not a very good idea to do this for two main reasons. The first is it doesn't benefit the poorest farmers because they do not have access to the formal financial system. They depend on moneylenders, and the government's policy of providing debt relief will not reach them. The second reason is that it is unfair to those farmers who actually pay their debts, who service their loans. It is also not beneficial for the banks because even now they may be compensated by the government for the loans that are being forgiven, but in future it discourages every farmer who borrows from the banks to repay the loans because they can wait for a new government relief scheme, and that will cause loan losses for the banks. Because of that, it will ultimately also not benefit farmers because banks will be more reluctant to lend into the agricultural sector because the risk has increased. I think a case can be made for loan forgiveness in the event of natural catastrophes such as the floods in eastern Nepal recently. Those people are clearly not in a position to repay their loans, and some sort of relief should be provided. But as a general policy, I think it is not compatible with sustained growth of the agricultural sector.
You've traveled to all the three distinct geographical regions of Nepal, the mountains, the hills and the flatlands. How do you see the economic variations in these three distinct geographies?
Well, I think Kathmandu and the Terai are clearly the economic heartland of Nepal. Incomes there are highest, population density is highest, the infrastructure is best. Although there are, of course, some pockets of poverty also in the Terai, in the rural areas. But overall, the economic potential of these areas is the highest. There's the agricultural plains in the lowlands are having much higher yields than in the hills or on the mountains, of course, and industry is also concentrated in those areas. As for the mountains, the economic potential there is extremely limited, essentially tourism. Where there's tourism, incomes are relatively high, but where there's none, people are extremely poor. So here it is the government's job to provide the connections to enable more tourists to come into those regions and raise the incomes of the local population. In the hills, in the middle, there are also topographical challenges. The road connections are very difficult. But there's also more opportunities. There are some agricultural, especially in niche products for specialized markets. There's also potential for tourism, and hydroelectric power generation may also provide income.
We'll continue with our conversation after a short break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Power Talks. We are in conversation with Mr. Alexander Pitt, the resident representative of IMF to Nepal. Mr. Pitt, you've been in Nepal for almost 3 years, during the time when we officially ended Maoist revolution, began the peace process and formed the Constitution Assembly. Yet we're in a phase of transition. How do you see Nepal's current economy and its future?
Well, I've indeed been able to witness tremendous progress in the political area, and I hope to see even more strides towards a lasting peace during the remainder of my stay here. On the economy, Nepal has been able to maintain macroeconomic stability, meaning low inflation, higher reserves, even during the time of the conflict and also in the time of political transition. This is no small achievement. This outcome has been made possible by prudent fiscal policies by successive governments, by the maintenance of the peg of the Nepali to the Indian rupee, and by the inflow of remittances, which have raised the international reserves of the Nepal Rashtra Bank to a very comfortable level, and at the same time have raised incomes and lowered poverty throughout Nepal. But macroeconomic stability is not enough. Economic growth is the second most important ingredient to reduce poverty. However, on the important question of economic growth, the performance has been less good. Over the past 5 years, growth has averaged only 4%, which is too low for Nepal, especially when considering that Nepal is one of the poorest countries in Asia. Therefore, raising the economic growth rate, building on the macroeconomic stability that we have already achieved, should be the top priority for policymakers in the future.
But when we look at only 25 million population and Nepal having rich prospects in tourism, agriculture and hydropower, it's not very difficult for Nepal to revive its economy and progress in this sector. What are the prerequisites that Nepal need to achieve it?
There are several things that need to go right before Nepal can realize its economic potential. First of all is a normalization of politics. By this, I mean that political conflicts are fought out in parliament and not on the streets. Roadblocks and industrial disputes, which are to a large extent driven by politics, have taken a huge toll on the economy. So bans, strikes, road blockages should stop. Labor disputes that are driven by politics and not by genuine questions about workers' issues should stop. At the same time, politicians need to pull together at least on a few issues. Getting roads built, getting power plants built should not be held hostage to political competition. A next point is that the state needs to set and enforce the rules of the economic game. For example, cartelization in many areas of the economy is widespread, for example, transportation and retail trade. This implies that people pay too much for inferior goods and services. The state must make sure that competition prevails and cartels cannot be established. A third point is that the government bureaucracy must become more efficient and governance must improve. Every year the budget plans significant investments, and every year the budget is not executed fully. This year, large amounts of resources have been provided to the state by the outstanding performance of the revenue services, but these resources are not being used. So the bureaucracy must be made to work better and more efficiently. There are many reasons for the current weaknesses. One is, for example, the frequent rotation of staff. Another is the pervasive political interference. And the third, of course, is corruption. A fourth point that I would like to mention, and which is related, is public investment. The Nepalese economy needs to have more public investment in basic infrastructure. We all experience daily the power shortages. For private persons, this is an inconvenience, but for industries, this is life-threatening. We cannot wait, the Nepalese economy cannot wait for 10 years until a new hydroelectric power plant may be built. We need some quick fixes. Another area is transportation. There are too few roads, both national highways and feeder roads. Travel times are too long. This forecloses economic opportunities and leaves people poor. One of the best ways to combat poverty is connecting people and markets, and this is done through roads.
Nepal's current financial survival is dominated by remittance. To what extent will the global recession and floods in exchange rate affect it?
Well, several of the countries where Nepali workers have been going are severely hit by the crisis, so this should clearly have a negative impact on Nepal. But there are also positive signs. Some countries are less affected, and some professions are less affected. For example, security guards versus construction workers. And Nepal is also opening up new destinations for its workers, for example, in Libya. On top of that, the numbers that we have from the Nepal Rashtra Bank do not show a decline in remittances. On the contrary, they have been rising quite steeply. We don't know what the future will bring, but so far things do not look that bad. However, should remittances stop growing or declining, the sectors that have so far been benefiting from these inflows, especially on banking and real estate, the Nepal Rashtra Bank needs to have a vigilant eye to prevent systemic risks.
The banks in Nepal in recent time has been investing extensively in the real estate, especially in the apartment constructions in the capital city. Is this recent surge a wise investment, or will it backfire in the future?
This is, in the IMF's view, a significant risk. Real estate prices have been rising very rapidly recently. To be sure, there are some legitimate reasons for real estate prices to increase, for example, the migration to urban areas. But for the most part, price increases have been driven by too cheap credit and by the lack of investment opportunities in other areas. So the Nepal Rashtra Bank must exercise vigilant supervision of the financial sector. There are too many banks that are highly exposed to the real estate sector, and this is a danger for the system as a whole.
The IMF has been supportive of Nepal's financial and economic endeavors. How do you assess the past and present, and what are the future prospects of cooperation?
Nepal has been a member of the IMF since 1961, and we have had a very fruitful relationship. I'm happy to say that relations with successive governments have been very cordial, and I look forward to continued cooperation in the future. Nepal has borrowed from time to time from the IMF, most recently between 2003 and 2007, when the IMF was providing assistance under its concessional lending window. This lending was designed to augment the reserves of the Nepal Rashtra Bank, as is always the case when the IMF provides money. Fortunately, now Nepal is not in a position where it requires financial assistance, but of course, if that should happen in the future, again, we stand ready to provide such assistance. The IMF is also providing technical assistance in various areas, most importantly in the revenue administration, tax and customs, and also to establish a single treasury account which will improve the government's control over its finances. Until very recently, we have also provided technical assistance to the Nepal Rashtra Bank to improve financial supervision.
If Nepal is to write its constitution on time, hold the parliamentary elections, and restore a functioning long-term government, then what should be the economic focus for the young economic leaders of the country?
Raising economic growth. Growth provides opportunities, growth provides rising living standards, growth is the surest way to reduce poverty. But to achieve this, the issues that I mentioned before need to be tackled. Politics has to be normalized, the rules have to be enforced, the bureaucracy has to work more efficiently, and investments have to be made in physical assets and infrastructure as well as in people.
Let's hope that the Constitution is written on time and the young people takes the leadership and provides to the country what it deserves. With this hope, I wish you good luck and goodbye. See you next week, the same time. Thank you for being with us.